Hi everyone, in today's video, we're gonna learn the 3 most important React hooks for you as a beginner. So we're gonna learn about useState, useEffects, and useMemo, and we're gonna go through from scratch at a basic level, at a beginner level, on how to use useState, useEffects, and useMemo on React application. So we're gonna understand everything about those, what is React hooks, how to use it with components, and we're gonna even have a functional kind of like project going on. We're trying to add some state into it. So we're gonna have like some basic bare minimum UI, and we're gonna try to add some state into it with, useState, useEffects, and useMemo. So let's go ahead and get started. But before jumping into this, I wanna thank our today's sponsor, Skillshare. So Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for creators. So you can explore new skills, deepen existing passions, or get lost in your own creativity. I find a lot of classes out there and with different and variety of awesome topics that you can explore. For example, in here we have the best for web development, since we were interested in coding and web development in general, how to improve yourself in this particular field. It has too many classes on those fields and they are top rated classes. So there's so many stuff with CSS Essentials, you can creative coding, and you can understand how productivity, how you can turn out your career, and so much more you can explore by yourself. The one class that I'm super interested on and I've been following for a while now is actually how to be your own boss and just give you strategies for launching your creativity career. It's from Martina Flor, and it just gave me so many info on how I can take my career from this particular step and turn it around into a completely new level. It just showcases you all the things that you need to do. It walks you through on a real world examples and how to do it with your own skills. It's so awesome to follow all of that on Skillshare on this particular class. So Skillshare is created specifically for learning, meaning it has no ads, and they are always launching premium classes, that top-notch classes, always for you, which means you can take your creativity wherever it takes you. It has so many features and so many awesome classes and topics that you can follow along with other members. It also has the ability that you can follow along with teachers and you get this huge inspiration in real time and connect with top-notch teachers around the whole platform while you're also working with other members. So specifically, since we all are lucky today and since Skillshare is our sponsor today's video, you are having a special offer. So you can head down in the description below. You're going to find a link that is going to give you a 1 month free access for the first 1,000 subscribers, lucky subscribers by the way, that's going to click the link and they are actually going to be able to join the actual platform. So what you're waiting for? Go ahead, claim your account and start learning with Skillshare and their top rated classes. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first one and the most basic hook that we need to learn is useState. So if you're just getting started with useState and you haven't actually figured out your head around useState and why it's a little bit kind of confusing and what is all of this syntax, especially if you're not really that familiar with ES6 syntax or ECMAScript version 6 syntax, React uses this syntax heavily, so sometimes you find some difficulties. But we're gonna go through this example in here. I created this space trip example where you can enter your email, you click a button to join the waitlist in here, and there's some a switch button in here to select to send email updates or not. Just a basic example just to showcase how state can work and how can we integrate hooks in order to make this more if this is currently non-stateful components. So this is actually a stateless component, just like a functional component that renders something on React. But we want to turn this from a stateless component into a stateful component that actually has state and manages the state internally inside of this functional component. So to get started, what we want to do is actually we want to make this button right here. Is actually whenever we change it, we want to tell the state that we changed the button. We keep track of the current state of the button. For example, it's currently active and we want once it's active, we keep that track of. Once it's not, we need to keep track of that both ways. So to do so, we use React useState. So for this, we do const and we open up the those destructing syntax. And this is called a destructing syntax because this is ES6 destructing syntax. If you return an array and how to access basically arrays, elements of that, this is how you do it. So we simply here put the first parameter of this, or the first element we need to do is actually the variable that we're gonna have like the state on. For example, I'm gonna name my variable is checked, and this would be either true or false. So this is a boolean, tells us if this current element is checked, which is like, is it active or is it not checked? So you can name this is checked or is active, it's pretty much the same. And the second parameter is the function that is going to allow us to basically trigger or change the state of this particular variable and change the state of this particular element by linking it throughout the element itself. Let's see how can we do that. So we do set checked. You can name this whatever. Those names haven't, they're not restricted to these names. You can put whatever names you want. You can just like, those are just two variables. This is a function and this is an actual Boolean variable. And here we do use state, but we first have to import use state. So you can go import use state from React on top in here. Make sure to use this syntax in here in order to be able to import named export. Okay, so you put a use state and you open up. So this is the function. By default, it takes nothing between the brackets in here. But what you want to include is actually the default value that you want to supply to this particular element. So the default value, so whatever you supply in here, for example, false, this one by default is going to have false if no state changes are made to the actual state itself. So if this box didn't change, this is checked is always going to be false by default. Of course, you can set this true or false. If you set something else, the variable type in here is going to change, of course. But we want to just start false because we want like the user to have updates at the beginning. Okay, so we Control S, we save. Now we're not using this state anywhere, so this state doesn't have any effects at all. But we have to tell it that we want to use this particular state in order to tell it how to work. So we can go ahead and use that. So we do, for example, we've got this is the checkbox that we want. So you go to your elements, and this element is actually a normal checkbox. So it's like a switch, a regular radio button, or regular input. I'm using Bootstrap in here, by the way, just to make things a little bit clearer, but everything would be the same for you if you have your own element. So what we want to include in here, so you go and you type the first, we're going to be like checked, and this is the value of this particular one. So checked in here, we want to supply it to is checked. So is checked in here, whenever this variable, this particular one changes, it's going to pass that change to the checked variable, to the checked prop on this form checked. And the component itself is going to react to these changes and is going to take care of that. It's going to like change that. So for example, in here, if I refresh, this is by default is false and it doesn't have that. But let's say we want to by default this to be true, right? And remember, this is checked is actually a link to this. So I save that as curiosity and I refresh. As curiosity, I'm not even changing those. And this is by default having this as active. If I do that again, like make it false, there you go. By default, it has that. So now this particular component is controlled by this state, and this state is basically the main portal to control this component state, whether it's active or not. Of course, this function right here is the way to basically trigger a state change of is checked variable. So whatever value we set through this function, the is checked in here is going to change and it's going to trigger a change on the component itself. Of course, later on is going to trigger a UI change. It's going to change this one. So you see right now, I click on these and it doesn't change. Why is that? Because we hard coded that we said false is going to become on is checked in here and it's always going to be false. So how can we do that? Is actually using events. So I can go ahead, have the other event, which is called onChange, and the onChange event is actually triggered whenever you change the actual, like you click on the button or you change any components. Those primitive components, because this checkbox is a primitive HTML component or like primitive elements on the browser. If it's a button, it has that as well. If it's an input, it does have that as well. But what you want is actually whenever it changes, it's going to trigger an event and it's going to call a callback. So what you can do a callback, the first element it takes as a callback is actually the event. So you can name this as an event and you open up that and here you create your callback. And this is actually just an ES6 error callback. Now the event in here holds the actual data of this particular element of the state of it. So how can we get that state? So we do const, let's go and create and another element. So you say, for example, new value of checked, or of is checked, just to be more clear. And I do event.target, so access the target, and the target is actually the actual DOM element, and we do is checked. Now we access the DOM element and we know if it's checked or not. Okay? Now, last but not least, we need to update the state. So we need to use this function to basically change this variable. So this variable goes ahead and changes this state of the checked one of this particular component. So this component can later on go ahead and react to this and basically change and update the UI of this particular element whenever we click on it. So to do so, we do isChecked, then we do new value of isChecked. And of course, all of these, this one, that one, and isChecked are all booleans. Okay? So you Control S, I save this. Now, whenever I use my mouse, I click on these. As you see, this one is particularly changing the state, which means this one is updating. So that's in a nutshell how EuseState works, just in a basic level. So you have two variables, one to control the state, the other one to tell you the current status of the state, or just like the only source of truth of the state. And here, this is the default value of the state. Of course, you can have this as a string, as whatever, but let's just go ahead and have a quick exercise on how to turn this input. Currently, I can type on it, but I don't have access to the text that is being typed in here on my component. So I want to know what is being typed on the input and get it on my own state in here inside of the component. So I'm going to go a little bit quicker into this. So how can I do this? I can go and do create a new state. I'm going to name this input, or say email, and set email. Okay. And for the naming conventions, always you want to choose variable names that have related, or have some relation to the actual components or the data it holds on. So this way you ensure that you're basically writing a cleaner code and a little bit more understandable code for people who are basically going to be reading your code later on. Okay, so here we use state, and here we pass in the default value. You can leave this empty, but I don't advise you to never leave use state empty. And I'm going to pass in an empty string because an email is actually a string, right? And I want to start in with an empty string. Empty. There's no email. Okay. So I go back in here. We have this as checked. Now I'm going to do this email the same thing. Now the form control, which is basically a normal input, what has this prop value called the value. So the value in here controls the actual value that is being showed up inside of this particular input element. So whatever you're passing in here is going to end up right here, is going to show up inside of this particular input. Sweet. So to do so, let's go ahead and see the value in here. I'm going to do email. So I'm just going to pass in the email. Now I'm going to use the same onChange in here, and I'm going to react to the actual things. I'm going to Control C. I'm going to copy this one. I'm going to paste this. So this onChange is going to trigger whenever I type in a single letter or a single character inside of this particular input element. Okay? Sweet. But instead of accessing isChecked in here, we need to access value. And of course, you need to change the variable name. So for example, you say new value simply. And here you say new value, but you don't need to do set checked, but this time you need to do set email. So you set the new email right into here. You can name this new email just to make it a little bit more descriptive for you guys. And here's actually the new email. So as soon as we type a new character in here, it's going to reflect onto this. The onChange event is going to trigger. We're going to have this function triggered. We're going to grab the new email, and we're going to eventually set the new email into this particular state. Now this state is going to re-render the whole component, and the new component is going to make sure to tell you that this email variable has the new value of this particular input element. And of course, React handles this all behind the scenes, so you don't have to worry about any of those. You need just to call the code. You do set email, and you're gonna have this eventually. Okay, so I'm gonna have email right here. I'm gonna have email put in there. I'm gonna Control C or Control S, save that. And here, as soon as I type in a new email, it's gonna basically change. And if you look into the variable of this email, it's basically going to have this particular email, at whatever, and you can basically type whatever inside of it. Cool. How sweet is that? And we have actually added state to two particular elements. That's so easy with EuseState. The second most important hook for React is EuseEffect. I'm pretty sure there is no application that you can basically create on React that doesn't or won't include EuseEffect. It's basically the main binding or the main connection line between the actual React lifecycle that is going behind the scenes and running the whole lifecycle of your application and the actual UI and the code you're managing. So if you're not familiar with how React lifecycle works, or what is the React lifecycle, so if you never worked on React, so this particular website in here, I really advise you to go ahead and check it out and play around with it a little bit. This one shows you the actual lifecycle behind the scenes of what is happening on React. And those methods are actually, compatible or part of the actual class component of React. They don't exist on the functional components, but they exist on the actual class components. On the functional components, we replace most of these methods using EuseEffect. So for these, we get, for example, should component updates. We get the render method, which is basically our functional component. We get the get snapshot before updates, React update DOMs, and we get those three different methods. And those are the binding point of the whole application. Those methods are going to tell us what is the current life cycle of the React application we're running, so we can manage different variables, we can initialize variables, we can dispose and remove variables from the memory. And in general, those are going to allow us to basically manage the application a little bit better. Now, EuseEffect is going to replace those three methods. It's going to replace the component did mount, component did updates, and the component will mount, all using a single method, and it's so convenient and it's so easy to use. So let's see how can we make that work using state components. So I'm going to access mine here. Sorry for this. So I'm going to have VS Code right here. Okay, going back. Now, what we're going to do is actually react to the email changes. Now, I've actually put an email regex in here, which is just a regular expression that checks if an email address is valid or not. So I'm going to use EuseEffect, and I'm going to listen for events that is going to come through to this one. Now, EuseEffect has a lot of stuff that you can do. Now, let's say first, what I want to do is actually I'm going to do component did mount. Okay, so for this case, I can just go in and do EuseEffect. I put the EuseEffect in here, make sure to import this from React. You have your callback in here, which is the code that is going to run based on the criteria that is going to be between both of these brackets, between this array you say in here. That's basically how EuseEffect works. So whatever you put in here, like for example, I got an empty array, that's going to tell EuseEffect to run only once on component did mount. So EuseEffect right here, or this particular callback in here, is going to be run only once this particular component is mounted and rendered for the first time. And basically, the component did mount is going to do the job in here, and this EuseEffect is going to basically run when you do have that. So for example, when can we know that? For example, I can do an alert, so I can do mounting components. And when you want to use component did mount, is actually for initialization or like adding event listeners to the actual DOM. So mounting is just right before like rendering is that what's basically like happens. So whenever you mount into it, you can add event listeners. So once the users start interacting with the actual browser and with the actual application you have, you're going to have those listeners in place and listening for every single event you basically want your users to have, obviously. So let's go and save that, and this is going to run right after that. I'm going to refresh. So as soon as I refresh, I'm going to get mounting components. Can you see the React application is just like still running? As soon as I click OK, that run. So like the first mounting point is basically this is where it's going to happen. So as soon as it mounts, seriously, it's right before like it shows up anything, right before the browser renders anything. That's what's going to happen. So this is what happens most importantly. So you get all initialization happens before the actual showing and rendering basically goes right into the browser. Now, let's say we want to add an event listener. So I'm going to add an event listener on the actual document. So I'm going to do documents.body.add an event listener. So this one is going to allow us to add a new event listener. I'm going to add a click event listener. And this event listener is going to run a function. So I would rather, for any event listener, especially DOM event listeners, you would rather create a new function, which is going to create basically a brand new function reference on the memory. Then you can pass it right here, rather than creating, error functions, which are bad for this situation. So I can go and do like clicks on body. Okay, and this one is basically going to run when you click on the body. So I'm going to just do a console log, or let's just go in and try an alert, clicked on body, something like this. So whenever you click on the body, you're going to have that. So I'm going to do clicked on body, and you pass in the reference into it. Okay, so that's basically what it is in here. So you Control S, and this is going to actually join. You're not going to see anything first. When you refresh that, you're not going to see anything. But as soon as you click on the body, you're going to get clicked on body. You click on the body. I think the body is just right on the top. It doesn't have the full height. But the point is, this is going to like run, the event is going to run every single time you click on the actual body, because we got this event registered. But now if we remove obviously this event right here, you're not going to have this functionality anymore. So you click, for example, let me refresh that. You need to refresh. So you click on this, as you see, there is no effect at all. That works really, really well. Now, the third functionality that basically UseEffect can provide you, it is on components will mount. So when you can use that is basically to dispose any event listeners you have for your component. And in mounting a component means the component is not going to be like showed up on the screen anymore, and it's not going to be rendered. The user won't be able to interact with it. So if you just like in mount the components, like the components is in mounted, and you already added an event listener on component did mount, but you didn't, or you totally forget about disposing and removing the event listener, you're going to have this event listener even though that particular component isn't mounted, because event listeners are registered on the DOM sides, not on React sides. So React has no control over that. You have to explicitly remove them, otherwise they will not work with you. So how you do that, UseEffect provides us with an awesome, simple API to do this. You basically need to return a function, and this function is going to play the role of components will mount. So this function, this particular function right here, will be called whenever our component is going to be mounted, basically. So what you can do is basically you could copy this one, and instead of like add event listener, you do remove event listener. And of course you need to pass it the same reference and the same type of events. You click on that. Now if I refresh real quick, I'm going to have that right here. So you see just like it's going to be working. But if I mount the components, basically this is not going to be like working anymore. So in mounting components, as I said before, you'll not be able to see it or something. And the most other important functionality of UseEffect is actually keeping track of a particular state variable, for example, email or isChecks or whatever, and reacting to any changes that goes through on this particular variable. And of course, this callback would be called every single time, for example, this variable changes. So all you need to do is actually include the variable or the list of variables. You can add as many variables in here, but we would like only to basically keep an eye or watch the email changes. So whenever this email is going to change, this UseEffect is going to be called. So what we want to do is actually whenever an email is changed, I want to run this regex, and I want to like check if the email address is correct or not. And of course, I'm going to like, show up a console log. You basically what you want to do in a real world scenario is basically like show the actual error message that just like beneath the input right here, telling him, please enter a valid email address or something like that. So how to do this is pretty basic. So you want to do like is valid email. I'm going to do const. I'm going to do email regex. Okay. And I'm going to do test. And I'm going to pass it the actual email that we have got. So if it is not valid, I'm going to do if not is valid email address. What we do is console log, please enter valid email. Sweet. So we save that, and this is only going to be running when the email is actually changed. As you see, as I refresh in here, this is not going to be running on mount. So, but when I put something in here, as you see, this start happening. Okay, put something, please enter a valid email address. As soon as I enter something, so how to do that, I'm going to just like remove this, enter the last character, and the screws in here, this one is a valid one. But now it starts to tell me this is not a valid email anymore. Simple. So this is what UseEffects can be used for. There's, those kind of scenarios. There are so many other advanced scenarios that UseEffect can be used at, either with async stuff, promises, and more stuff. But at the basic level, this is all you need to know on how to use UseEffect in order to manage your components lifecycle. For the third most important hooks for React is useMemo. I see a lot of people underestimating useMemo because they feel like they don't need useMemo, while it's completely otherwise, because EuseMemo is actually the performance kind of guide that allows you to make your React application more performance without actually noticing those little teeny tiny side effects. So EuseMemo is basically based on memoization. If you type that on Google, you're gonna find like memoization is basically a type of like caching, where first you calculate the actual result, but later on, if the input doesn't change, you basically return the same result that you got before because the input originally didn't change. So why would you recalculate that where you can save basically performance and stuff like that, and you return the same result? So for example, you can take on this Fibonacci example in here. And Fibonacci, we all know for Fibonacci how we calculate this. We got this basic function in here, but the Fibonacci of 20 is a quite big number, and it takes a little bit of time to calculate this. If you take this to like 30 or something, the program is going to crash. It's going to take this a couple of minutes to basically figure this out. But let's go with 20 in here. Now, let's say in here, the result is going to be like, if we refresh that, the component mounts, it renders only once. If the component renders only once, in this particular case, it just like, it console logs the result for a single time. And this is the result of that Fibonacci. But let's say, let's cruise in here, since we console logging and we are calculating the Fibonacci of 20 every single time, this demo is going to re-render. So if any variable, if the email is checked, is going to like change, and we all know if useState has some changes, it's basically it's going to be like triggering a re-render on the React lifecycle, which means this component is going to be like re-rendered all the way again, and this is going to be recalculated all the way again. So you can imagine this overhead that this Fibonacci is going to be called, if you type in your whole email, if you have like your email address has like 100 characters, it's going to be called 100 characters plus. Crazy, right? So if you try to do that, for example, I type something in here, it's clear to see I start getting all of these values here every single time. It's clear to see, and the list goes on and on and on. If I do this is checked, it's going to happen again. It's pretty bad. Now, EuseMemo is going to be our Superman for today, and it's going to save the day. How is do that? Let's go and try to use EuseMemo. So for example, I can comment this. I can go back in here, do this as results. I do EuseMemo. And for EuseMemo in here, obviously the EuseMemo is going to be imported as the same as the other hooks from the React in here as a named import. And here, the first EuseMemo it takes, let me show you that. So it takes a factory, which is the function that is going to return the result. So whatever function you can basically pass in through, and it calculates something, and the return value of this function is going to be returned through to this particular variable. Okay, so what we want to return in here is simply a function that is going to return Fibonacci of 20, right? So this is the calculation. So whatever we return from this function is going to be ending up on this result. Now, the other variable, the second parameter, is the most important one. Now, this is the dependency list. It's basically the same as the others. It takes an array, but this dependency list, it tells it when you want to recalculate, because if you just like leave it like this way, it's only going to recalculate once and only once only. So if you have any variables or input that you're going to be putting right here, for example, you can tell it whenever the email is going to change, you need to recalculate the Fibonacci. It doesn't make sense, right? But this is just an example. Look, so whatever variable you're passing in here, you need to put it on the dependency list in here. So whenever that input variable changes, it basically is going to recalculate this all over again. But if you leave it empty, it's going to be running only once. And this is what we need for this case, because we only need to run the Fibonacci of 20, since this is a static input. We always know what it is. You only need to run it once, okay? So you save that. If you go back in here, like completely refresh, starting from scratch, seriously, we get this result only once, and we keep getting this result, but we're not going to keep like recalculating this. It's not going to take any time to recalculate this, because this is actually completely cached. And how can we make sure to do that? I can do this. I can put this console log inside of here. I can just go right here, and the console log, yeah, we can't have this, but I can do, for example, const fib, and I can do console log fib in here, and I can do return fib. Okay, this is a demo, just to show you how this is actually working. Now, if I start from scratch, refresh that, I'm gonna get a result in here first, but if I type something in here, it's not going to change. If you change that, it's not going to happen because, as I said before, this use memo is going to only be running once and running once only. Some of you might say, why we won't use use effect? It's completely different. Use memo is made for this particular purpose, for memoization, and in fact, memo is just like, a shortcut for memoization. So this is what its job is being doing, and in fact, this can allow you basically to return any variable that you want in here, and you can reuse it throughout the whole application or the rendering logic. It's pretty good, right? So anyway, guys, hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I was just gonna give you like getting started with React hooks, the three important React hooks that I find a lot of beginners who are getting started with React really struggling to understand. So I give you a simple introduction to all of these, and hopefully this was helpful for you guys, and catch you all hopefully in the next ones.